Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about phenomenological pragmatism, the difference between the continentally concrete and analytically empirical. And I recently had a great conversation, magnificent conversation with Dr. Cadell Last, whose work on Hegel is just extraordinary. And we were discussing how in Hegel you have abstraction, negation, and concretion, which would be the full arc of sublation. So, for example, you have the idea of the entrepreneurship you want to start. Then you negate that idea by bringing it into reality. So the idea ceases to be an idea and it's brought into reality and thus made concrete. So the concretion, the making concrete, is the negation that leads to the completion of the sublation. It brings it into being. And there's this really funny idea that there's a real sense in which an idea is not even an idea if it isn't made concrete, if it isn't brought or realized into the actual world. And I guess a way to think of this is that if you have an idea of how of a successful business, but you never realize that business, well, then you actually never think through the idea fully, because it's only once an idea is realized that you see all the unintended consequences, you see all the details you never thought of. It's only in the act of trying to make an idea real that you actually fully even think the idea. So there's a sense in that ideas that stay ideas are practically not even ideas. And I really like this point because I've always really liked pragmatism, like Mr. Pierce, Mr. Peirce, Richard Rorty, William James, these different people. But there's always been this interesting problem in my thinking where the categories of phenomenology, empiricism, and pragmatism all kind of blur together. They're all very similar. And this discussion with Dr. Last really brought to mind a need to focus in on the differences between phenomenology, empiricism, and pragmatism. And what exactly is the epistemological nature of a lot of the papers or different things that we try to do at OG Rose. And what I kind of came up with is something I want to call phenomenological pragmatism. I would argue that most of the time when people talk about pragmatism, they're actually talking about something more like empirical pragmatism, which is the idea that we observe the world around us, and then we practice. We are practical based on what we observe. But that sounds very much like phenomenology, which is trying to pay attention to how we experience the world, what experience is like. So what's the difference between phenomenology and empiricism? And what I try to do in this paper is argue, to start, that both phenomenology and empiricism ultimately are toward pragmatism. They ultimately inform a pragmatism, and that every single pragmatism, all types of pragmatism, are going to be informed, which is to say formed within either phenomenology or within empiricism. Therefore, every pragmatism is either a phenomenological pragmatism or it is a empirical pragmatism. And generally speaking, I think most of the time when people talk about pragmatism, they're talking about more empirical pragmatism. But I would argue that it's precisely empirical pragmatism that gives us the scientism, or the removal of the subject, that is a major characteristic of what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis today. And that what we need is a phenomenological pragmatism, which is a life of practice, or that organizes philosophical concerns and practices the proper response to those philosophical concerns in terms of phenomenology, which I will argue, as I'm defining it in this context, becomes concerned with the subject. So again, all pragmatisms are going to be formed within either phenomenology or empiricism. And very problematically, if you just jump to saying, oh, I'm a pragmatist, then you're not even aware or conscious of the theoretical framework that your pragmatism is defined as itself within. And that means you're probably very susceptible to capture or enacting an ideology without ever even realizing it. There was this paper we did on the Protestant work ethic, which Weber talks about. And the idea there is that one of the reasons why many Protestants were susceptible to enacting this capitalistic work ethic is because they had a sola scriptura doctrine, which means that they thought that the only authority for theology, for spiritual direction, was from the Bible alone. But very problematically, you have to interpret the Bible, and in order to interpret well, you have to think outside the Bible, which, if that's not an option, then you end up thinking you're just reading the Bible, and you end up reading capitalism into the Bible. And so then what ends up happening is your interpretation of the Bible, precisely because you don't think it's interpretation, you think it's just reading, ends up being an instance where you read capitalism into the Bible without even knowing you're doing it. Well, something very similar will happen if we just say, oh, we're pragmatists, and not think about, or we're practical people, and not think about what ideas we have and why of what constitutes the practical. It's just very likely we're going to be captured by the zeitgeist of the age or the ruling ideology. So we need to be aware that pragmatism is always situated within, informed by some ideology. And in here, I'm really focusing in on phenomenology and empiricism. Now, we could say that that phenomenology is the study of experience as if entities aren't a factor. So it's really focused on the experience. Whereas empiricism is the study of entities as if experience isn't a factor. So the experienced per se. Whereas pragmatism then becomes the study of knowing through doing. So experienced, like someone who's experienced. So in phenomenology, the focus is on the experience itself. Whereas in empiricism, the focus is on the entities we experience in a way that is trying to make the fact that those entities are experienced, those objects, secondary. That experience becomes secondary. Science is trying to generally bracket out the subject. And please do not mistake me as saying in this paper that phenomenological pragmatism is always better than empirical pragmatism, or that philosophy is always better than science or something like that, because that's very situational. It completely depends on what you're researching and what you're trying to do and what you're thinking. The problem becomes that if we don't have a distinction between phenomenological pragmatism, or what I'll call PP, and empirical pragmatism, which I'll call EP, well, then we're going to blur them together and not even realize we're doing it, and make a lot of mistakes. Now, again, one of the reasons why I think we need a term like phenomenological pragmatism is because, say, a lot of phenomenology in the past, say Edmund Husserl's, seems to have been trying to get to a science of experience to experience, pure experience, in the same way that scientism may be trying to get to objects, pure observation, if you will. Both of these are what Reconstructing ASA is going to talk about as AA thinking. Neither one of them is dialectical, and that will lead to effacement, so it's very problematic. Also, experience to experience could ignore the subject, the experiencer, the person, just as much as could a science that brackets out the subject and subjectivity in favor of objectivity. So we have to define phenomenological pragmatism as distinct from, say, forms of phenomenology that make the subject secondary. Now, arguably, Hegel's phenomenology doesn't bracket out the subject, and in fact makes the subject central. And maybe Montpensier, the phenomenology of perception, different thinkers. So there's different schools of phenomenology, but I want to emphasize that this is not a phenomenology, PP is not a phenomenology that is going to be bracketing out the subject. It's going to be a phenomenology of the absolute as opposed to the truth, which is a distinction that was made in the wonderful talk I had on absolute knowing with Cadell Last, where the absolute is everything that is the case plus the subject plus us, and the truth is everything that is the case, which is, of course, a play on Wittgenstein. So phenomenological pragmatism is going to be very concerned with the absolute. And some other characteristics of the difference between PP and EP. PP is going to be focusing on experience and the experiencer, whereas empirical pragmatism is going to be observation, so experience versus observation. PP, we have experience, subjectivity, the absolute, the metaphysical, and confidence versus certainty. Whereas in empirical pragmatism, we're going to have observation, objectivity, the truth, physicalism, and falsification versus verification. So PP, you have experience versus observation, you have subjectivity versus objectivity, the absolute versus the truth, the metaphysical versus the physicalist, and the confidence versus falsification. Now, these categories certainly PP and EP overlap. They're going to inform one another. This is not a hard distinction, but I think understanding the difference can be very important. I think phenomenological pragmatism is also going to help us understand what exactly some of the more sociological philosophy is doing, which is, say, captured in the book Belonging Again, which is going to be like a thinker like Philip Reith or Hannah Arendt or Freud and Civilization is Discontent. All of those people are very concerned with how we experience ideas and practice social orders in light of those experiences. Arguably, a lot of political philosophy is in the business of of phenomenological pragmatism. So what is it like to thoughtlessly experience an idea in a society where you always grew up Christian and therefore Christianity is something that is thoughtless, it's given, it's just something people do? How do we organize ourselves experiencing the idea? What is the practice that leads to? And what is it like to have new ideas, and how can that destabilize the civilization? And in section 3 of the paper, I'm going to go into, so I just noted how PP can kind of lead itself in the direction of understanding sociological philosophy. And then in section 3, I try to go through sort of the story, I guess, of how my thinking came to something like that I want to call phenomenological pragmatism. One of the main thinkers is Charles W. Mills in his extraordinary Blackness Visible, and I've referenced this part before, where he points out on this idea that there's this question in philosophy of the question of other minds. How do you know other minds exist? And he just makes the extraordinary point where he says, if you're a slave and your daily existence is defined by oppression, by forced intercourse of the world, it is not going to occur to you to doubt about your oppressor's existence in any serious fashion as a pressing philosophical problem. The idea seems frivolous, a perk of social privilege. This sentence was extraordinary to me because it made it clear that a lived experience could help you figure out which philosophical questions were likely erroneous in their very asking. At the time, I was also reading Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein was trying to suggest that a lot of philosophical problems could be dissolved if we simply understood the language correctly, if we understood how language works. Then we could dissolve many philosophical problems. But I'm not sure if Wittgenstein succeeded in that endeavor. He was trying to slice apart the Gordian knot of philosophical problems. But I found what Mills did here was where he's using experience to slice apart Gordian knots to be much more powerful. Now, it's also then what I thought it was much more successful than what Wittgenstein was doing. It reminded me too, in John Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, that part where someone's looking through the keyhole and they see a woman changing, and then they hear something, the floor creak, and they turn around and somebody's caught them and they are pinned down. In that moment, the peeping Tom knows other people exist. The gaze is undeniable. They really feel it. The idea that the other mind isn't there is just completely seems silly. So there was something here about experience that I began to think was a proof that became a sort of way to determine what philosophical problems may be errors in their very asking, a la kind of Wittgenstein, and which ones were valid, which philosophical questions were valid. So you could use experience as a kind of heuristic to determine valid ones. Now, very importantly, I should also note I was also studying economics, say Friedrich Hayek and Soel, and they were stressing the need for systems and managing and tests that we in economics can never determine the true ultimate value of a thing. The best we can do is come up with a system of price mechanisms and go from there. All of these thinkers, I'm getting interested in lived experience, practically knowing something as an epistemological standard, the need for tests, the inevitability of limitations, and the inevitability of uncertainty, which means we should seek confidence as opposed to certainty. So all of this, none of the arguments that are being presented, say by economics or Charles W. Mills or Sartre, none of these are going to be proofs of certainty. We can't be certain that other minds exist, but we can be so confident other minds exist because of these lived experience that the questions are practically answered, or they're practically addressed, we could say. They're not technically answered. The problem of other minds is not technically answered, but it is practically answered. To the point where it can make it seem like Dr. Mill said, the height of social privilege to consider asking the question. But the next move is, so all of this can give us practical answers, even if it cannot give us technical answers. Practical is a very important word, as I'll get into. This very methodology is justified if we take Kurt Gödel seriously and the incompleteness theorem. If indeed and I'm going to use the language of the map isn't the territory, which in epistemology we like to say that the map isn't the territory, which is to say an abstraction can never be an abstract representation can never be the thing that is represented. If it was, it would not be useful. It would be too complex. So the map can't be the territory. In a very similar way, that Gödel found that if a mathematical system or a set was completely coherent and had no internal contradictions, then there would be reason to think that it did not correspond, that it was not axiomatic. And so if you have complete coherence, that would be reason to think you do not have correspondence. So you can't, and if you can prove correspondence, there has to be an opening per se in the coherence, which would give you reason to think the system was not true. So you either have to trade coherence, you have to trade coherence and correspondence. You have to trade the accuracy of a map for its use. Which is to say that the more the map is like the territory, the less you can even identify the map as a map. So you have this very strange, what you could say is you have this inevitability of essential incompleteness, and that incompleteness is an inevitable feature of an ideology, a system, a worldview, and so on and so forth. Because I think what Mr. Gödel gives us can be expanded into many epistemic fields. Well, if that's the case, if incompleteness is inescapable, then the very fact that these philosophical questions can only be answered practically, not technically, is thereby justified. Because because Gödel would give us reason to expect that that's the best we can do, or that is good enough. Kurt Gödel gives us reason, validates the epistemology of phenomenological pragmatism, to assume that what is practically thus is thus, and that would also fall into the concretion with Hegel. So Gödel justifies the methodology of pragmatism to determine what systems we likely have enough of sufficient reason for, enough of an explanation for, to consider them addressed, even if not technically. Because what Gödel gives us is going to forever open a distinction, or possible distinction, between the practical and the technical, and therefore a practical answer easily could be the most answer we can get, because a technical answer may not be possible, precisely because what we are describing, the unknowability of the technical answer, could be a feature of reality itself. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. I would say the word practically, which I keep using, is possibly the most important word in the entire epistemology of O.G. Rose. Because the word has a lot of double meanings. It could be like practically, like you're living it out. Practically can also be a foundation for confidence, because in practice, X always turns out to be the case. Therefore, there's reason to be confident in X. Practically is also nice because it's almost. What's practically an answer is almost an answer. It's not technically an answer, but it's almost an answer. And an example of this wordplay from the paper, The Tragedy of Us, is if I say, for example, that capitalism destroys the arts, and you come back and say, well, no, there's nothing in the theory of capitalism, according to Adam Smith or Friedrich Hayek, that would make it the case that capitalism must destroy the arts. And in fact, capitalism could enable the arts. But if I were to argue instead and show you evidence that practically capitalism always destroys the arts, even if it doesn't technically have to destroy the arts, that would be a very valid argument. And the point would be that, well, if we follow Hegel, if capitalism practically always destroys the arts, then it does always destroy the arts. Because what happens in practice is the idea. What happens in practice is the reality. Even though capitalism doesn't technically have to destroy the arts, it could be the case that capitalism doesn't technically have to destroy the arts, and yet practically always does, because we've opened a gap between the technical and the practical, of which we should expect and feel justified to highlight following Kurt Gödel. And again, another way to put this is that in the theory of capitalism itself, which is completely coherent, there is no necessary reason why the arts must be destroyed under capitalism. But when the world tries to correspond with the theory of capitalism, it is practically always the case that the arts are destroyed. So you see, you see the phenomenological pragmatists would say that because capitalism is going to, one, be paying a lot of attention to what practically happens in a theory, and then say, well, because it's the case that the arts are always practically destroyed in capitalism, then capitalism always destroys the arts. The practice is the reality. The unfolding is the reality. Whereas the theory is a map, and of course you need theory in order to figure out what sort of society you're going to make. But the fact that the map says that X is located here, or that X is what should be occur, it does not follow that on the territory itself that you will find what the map says you will find, because territories change and territories are different than maps. So you can have a break between the practical and the technical, as you can have a break between the coherent and the correspondent, as you can have a break between the true and the rational. And we need a methodology to take that very seriously, and that would be phenomenological pragmatism. The other thing we can say is, I would want, in the Conflict of Mind book, explored pitch and risks, which is these situations, kind of like conspiracies, where the more you look into them, the more you see reason to keep looking into them, and then you get pulled out and you can never escape. Like a pitch and risk is a truth that is completely coherent, that you have reason to ascribe to, and yet doesn't correspond with reality. And so when you take a pitch and risk, you might get pulled into kind of like a void that you can never escape. I would argue that the likelihood for a pitch and risk greatly skyrockets where there's a split between the practical and the technical. Situations where you can only determine a practical answer but not a technical answer, or where you find a practical answer and yet can nevertheless ask a question that is technically not answered, that is where you could end up in a pitch and risk, a coherence that you will never be able to escape. And I think, say, the questions of do other minds exist is an example of a pitch and risk, because there would that is the inability to prove the existence of other minds, which is probably similar to the inability to prove with certainty that reality is real, that it's not a simulation or something like that. That inability to prove with certainty that other minds exist is likely a feature of reality, not a problem that can be solved. It's probably integrated into the very structuring of being. And if you were to solve being, you would efface it, you would erase it. You can't remove a feature or solve a feature of something without changing that something. But you could nevertheless spend your entire life trying to prove that reality wasn't a simulation or is a simulation, and you would always see reason to keep doing that, and you would get pulled deeper and deeper into the problem, and you would never escape. So another reason why PP is very important, phenomenological pragmatism is very important, is because it provides a heuristic to help identify what questions are likely pitch and risks and which ones are not. It should also be noted, though, that it doesn't really do us any good if we determine that there's no practical solution to the existence of other minds, if we then don't practice or live our lives accordingly. If we were to live as if other minds don't exist, or even if we in our heads assent to the practical reality that we can't know other minds don't exist, then we're not going to feel as if we have, as if the philosophical quandary has been addressed. So, for example, in the paper Homo Iago at the end of Reconstructing ASA, we're going to say that there's no technical answer to the problem of proving the existence of reality, only the practical answer of living life. But even if you know that, you still have to live the life. You still have to make a real choice and commit to something, because the paper is going to argue that committing is really, really key here in order for reality to feel real. So in order for your practical answer to feel like an answer and to make reality feel like it's actually real, you're still going to need to make a commitment, a Kierkegaardian leap of faith, and commit to something and really choose something, a non-rational action. And the details of what I mean by that will be explained in that paper. So likewise, if you conclude that there is no technical answer to the problem of other minds, but you still act like other minds are there, like you still act as if they are not there, or that they are fully knowable, as opposed to always concealed. And therefore you're going to engage in trying to really know what somebody is thinking, as opposed to accepting an inevitable amount of concealment, or you're going to indulge in metamentality, which there's a paper on. You know, all of these would constitute examples of not really practicing the practical answer to the problem. So there really does have to be a dialectic here between thinking and acting. We can't just think about practical answers. We have to practice the answers. But we're not going to do that if we don't understand that there is a distinction between a practical answer and a theoretical answer, which I'm afraid to say is not really captured in either phenomenology as AA, classical phenomenology, or pragmatism, which is AA. Because if you're just trying to get to the experience qua experience, well, then you're going to be looking for a technical answer. You're going to be looking for a coherence there, and believing that both the technical answer and the practical answer are the same thing in the same way. In hard empiricism, they're going to be treated the same thing as the same way. In phenomenological pragmatism, there can be a distinction between the theoretical and the practical. So thereby a dialectic between the two, and that's what I really want to hit on and focus on. Likewise, to really kind of focus on what I mean when I say that these philosophical inquiries that there might be a practical answer to, but not a technical answer, precisely because they are a feature of reality and thereby a expression of the essential incompleteness that Kierkegaard discusses. I think a way to kind of explain this is, if my red cup on my desk is here, it's not the same as the cat outside, right? You have a law of non-contradiction where a cup can't be a cat. That's just a feature of the world. Things cannot be other things without transforming and no longer being themselves. So non-contradiction is a feature of reality. You can't solve non-contradiction because that is a feature of reality. If you solved it, you would efface reality. So likewise, the inability to prove with certainty that other minds exist is easily a feature of existing and existence. Nevertheless, because we can practically live as if other minds exist and really have these pinned down situations like Sartre described where we really feel other minds, those give us reason to think that other minds exist that we cannot theoretically prove. And therefore, that also gives you reason to think that there's a divide between the theoretical and the practical, and that an epistemology should form that accepts that gap. In a similar way that, say, in vector theory by Alexander Lung and Alexander Bard, the gap between vectors is an essential dimension of being. And that if you try to get rid of that gap, you're going to get rid of reality, basically, or the universe, because that gap is an essential feature. So, considering all this, there is justified reason to accept these problems that cannot be solved technically, only practically, or practically managed, or practically dealt with, that they are features of reality. We're justified to do it because if you try to solve them, and you can't solve them, you might be solving the nature of being itself, and solving being is effacing it. To close, I really want to stress phenomenological pragmatism is not an effort to discard theory. For again, all ideas of the practical must be so defined from within a theoretical framework. We have a shorter work that says ideas are practically eyes, which means, one, ideas are always going to impact what you think is practical, but simultaneously practice is always situated within ideas. You cannot escape that. So this is not a work that is trying to say theory is bad. Theory is unavoidable. The issue is by not realizing there's a divide between the theoretical and the practical. Then the likelihood of us ending up in effacing AA thinking of completion, wholeness, so on and so forth, as discussed in the Philosophy of Lack series, is much higher. And the likelihood of arising to an AB epistemology drops like a rock. And so we really need to understand this gap and the difference between these things and to theorize accordingly. In closing, I think phenomenological pragmatism is better to take seriously, say, like both the practice of the Kyoto school and the practical of someone like a Richard Rorty, while the empirical pragmatism that I think tends to define most pragmatism today struggles a lot more to incorporate the Kyoto school and the thinking of someone like Hegel. Precisely because in EP, the subject is what you're trying to bracket out. Whereas in PP, you are bringing in the subject and really focusing on the experience of the subject and the absolute. Now, again, if you're trying to figure out the Big Bang or how the Big Bang happened, you're going to need empiricism. So this is not a hierarchy. And arguably, EP is better than some forms of Platonism, Cartesianism, and other theoretical traditions, which fail to take seriously lived experience. So there's good arguments to be made that empirical pragmatism is a improvement in the history of thought. But I'm of the opinion, as the meaning crisis shows, that we need to take another step into phenomenological pragmatism, which I do think is what Hegel had in mind, that it seems to be what Hegel had in mind. It's a mighty long road to find Hegel again, but I'm glad we walked it. After all, ideas are not experiences. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.